The idea of a lost continent, it's there, underneath the oldest stories we have. Atlantis is a powerful myth, but its foundations might be built on real history. There were ancient catastrophes, there were vanished cultures. They likely inspired this tale. A volcanic explosion could erase an entire society from memory. A single night of terror could sink a city into legend, and what it means for a civilization to be lost forever. Our search starts with a story. It's a story from over 2,000 years ago. Plato told it to his students. He's in a courtyard in Athens, and he says this is a true story, a story of great and marvelous deeds. It's written in two of his works, the Timaeus and the Critias. He describes an island nation. This was 9,000 years before his time. It was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. That's the Strait of Gibraltar now, so out in the Atlantic Ocean. This place was Atlantis. It had immense wealth, advanced engineering, rings of water and land around the city, grand temples, a complex society, but the people grew arrogant. They started a war. They tried to conquer the ancient Mediterranean, including an early, noble version of Athens. And then, in one day and night, there were earthquakes and floods. The whole island sank, it vanished. For Plato, this wasn't just an adventure tale. He was a moral teacher. Atlantis was an allegory. It showed how even a perfect society could decay from within. Corrupted by greed, by a thirst for power, and then destroyed by the gods as a consequence. He was crafting a philosophical fable about the ideal state and its downfall. But he framed it with very specific details, its location, its age, its political structure. He presented it as a genuine historical record, something passed down. That's the blurring of lines. That's what's fueled debate for centuries. Was Plato reporting a faint memory of a real catastrophe, using it to give weight to his lesson? Or was he purely a storyteller, world-building for a philosophical point? This account is the map he left. Every theory, every expedition, every piece of evidence we look at, it's an attempt to decipher that map. To see if it leads to a real place, or if it was always meant to guide us somewhere deeper, into the nature of human civilization itself. A fable needs a seed of truth. And that seed might be in the Aegean Sea. Around 1600 BC, there was an island called Thera. Today we call it Santorini. It was a Minoan outpost. The Minoans were sophisticated. Their palaces on Crete, like Knossos, had frescoes, dolphins, priestesses. Thera was a busy port, a vibrant place. Then the mountain at its center woke up. The eruption was enormous, one of the biggest in 10,000 years. It blew the island apart, left that crescent shape we see now. The immediate destruction was total. The town of Akrotiri was buried under ash, perfectly preserved, but the disaster spread further. The volcano collapsing into the sea would have caused a tsunami. A wall of water moving across the Aegean. There's evidence on the north coast of Crete, layers of pumice and ash from the sea. It points to huge waves, maybe tens of meters high, hitting the Minoan centers. These tsunamis would have wrecked the coastal towns, the fleet, the harbors, the palaces near the shore. The farmland flooded with salt water. After this, you see a sharp decline. Sites were damaged, then left empty. Trade routes fell apart. The civilization didn't vanish overnight. But its foundations were broken, the decline was rapid, and then you hear the echoes, an advanced island culture, known for its art, its peace, a cataclysm that comes with earthquakes. And then, decisively, the sea, a civilization that just seemed to disappear to later people, to the Greeks like Plato. The timelines are off, of course. It's not 9,000 years, but the story beats line up, an island kingdom, undone by natural fury, swallowed by the waves. This is more than a location theory. It's about a memory, a traumatic event so profound it echoed for centuries, changing in the telling, waiting for a philosopher to name it, to give it a moral. Atlantis, the Minoans were sophisticated. That's what makes the connection so strong. They built these great palaces, marvels of engineering, but not for war. For administration, for ceremony, for trade. At Knossos they had complex drainage, terracotta pipes for fresh water, for sanitation, a level of urban planning that would have seemed miraculous to later Greeks. And the walls were covered in art, frescoes of leaping dolphins, elegant priestesses, scenes from nature, a real sense of harmony, of prosperity. This was a thalassocracy, a sea empire. Its power came from trade, a vast network stretching from Anatolia to Egypt to the Levant. They were the masters of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, peaceful, advanced, untouchable. Then silence. After the Thera eruption, the record on Crete changes. Palaces like Knossos show fire, damage. Coastal settlements are abandoned. The intricate trade goods, the distinctive pottery styles, they begin to fade. The cultural heartbeat slows. Within a few generations, the Minoan identity gets absorbed. By the Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland to those later cultures, the Minoans didn't just decline. They vanished into myth, a half-remembered people of great power who were simply gone. The archaeologist Spiridon Marinotos linked Thera to the collapse. He saw the eruption as the pivotal blow, not just a natural disaster, a historical cataclysm. It severed a cultural lifeline. So you have to ask, what happens to a memory over centuries? Could the stories of this powerful, art-loving, seafaring empire have been passed down? Egyptian traders who knew the Minoans as partners might have carried tales. Tales of the great island that fell silent. Early Greeks inheriting Minoan sites, maybe some of their legends could have woven those fragments into their own stories. Over generations, the details blur. The location shifts west, out into the great ocean, the edge of the world. The peaceful traders get reshaped by a warlike culture into a formidable, antagonistic power. A perfect foil for a story about Athenian virtue. The sophistication, the sudden loss, the overwhelming power of the sea, all the pieces are there, waiting for a philosopher like Plato to assemble them. Into a warning for the ages, the real mystery isn't just finding a sunken city, it's how history becomes legend, how the echo of a lost world can sound for millennia. There's Thera, but there's also another event, much closer to Plato's own lifetime, the city of Helike on the northern coast of the Peloponnese. It was prosperous, a major power. Part of the Aegean League, and it was the main center for the worship of Poseidon, the sea god, the earthquake god. The city was tied to him completely. Its coins showed his image. They said it was the place where Poseidon first rose from the ocean. Then, in the winter of 373 BCE, it happened, an earthquake. The ground turned to liquid, and then a huge wave came in from the Corinthian Gulf. It just submerged the city. The historians wrote it down, Diodorus Pausanias. Survivors said they saw the bronze statue of Poseidon in his sacred grove, the last thing visible before it went under the water, as if the god was taking it back. The city was gone, wiped off the map. Its location was lost for centuries. This wasn't ancient history. Plato was a teenager in Athens when the news arrived. His family would have heard about it, a cultured Greek city devoted to Poseidon vanishing into the sea overnight. That trauma echoed everywhere. It was a direct template. A city punished, maybe for sacrilege, by the very force it worshipped, sinking in one night, earthquakes and flood. When Plato wrote his fable decades later, he had this event in mind. It gave him the mechanism, the suddenness, the total erasure by water, the lesson of divine retribution. Helike shows how recent trauma gets lifted. The details shift a little, they get amplified, and they're placed into a bigger myth. The story of Atlantis needed an ending that felt real. For an Athenian audience, the fate of Helike was that ending, terrifying and turned into legend. The search goes beyond the Aegean, though. There's a third possibility, much farther west, where the Mediterranean ends and the Atlantic begins, Tartessos. That's the name. Greek writers like Herodotus mentioned it with a kind of reverence. A semi-legendary kingdom, incredibly rich, located in what's now southern Spain. Its wealth came from metal. The rivers there were said to flow with silver. Tartessos controlled the copper, the tin, the precious metals that powered the Bronze Age. For Greek sailors from places like Phakia, going past the Pillars of Hercules was a bold move into the open ocean, and what they found was a partner. A source of almost mythical wealth, Tartessos was a real society. It had its own language, its own writing. It was a bridge between the Mediterranean world and the Atlantic. Then, around the 6th century BC, it just disappears from history. The trade goods stop, the references end. It becomes a ghost in the records. What happened? Some say its trade networks collapsed. Others point to a natural disaster, maybe floods that overwhelmed its low-lying towns. The land might have silted up. Its ports turned to marsh. The result was a void, a complete and puzzling end for a major power. And this is where the geography makes Tartessos fit so well. Plato was very specific. Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic. Tartessos is the only wealthy, advanced civilization the Greeks knew of that was located exactly there, right outside Gibraltar. It fits the location perfectly. The Greeks knew about its riches. They told stories of its king, Argantonius, who supposedly lived more than 100 years. And then they knew it was gone, a lost kingdom in the very area where Plato set his lost continent. So the possibility is that Tartessos gave the Atlantis story its geographical anchor. A real place that vanished, its memory faded over time. By Plato's day, Tartessos was already becoming a legend. Its reality had been swallowed by speculation, the same kind that surrounds Atlantis now. Could a philosopher gathering older tales have taken the truth of a vanished Western civilization and enlarged it, making it bigger, older, more advanced to serve a moral lesson about pride and collapse? Tartessos is still elusive. Its capital has never been definitively found, though archaeologists keep looking in the wetlands of Andalusia. It's a shadow on the edge of history. But sometimes a shadow is enough to cast a very long legend. A wealthy society here and then gone, leaving behind only stories of its splendor and its sudden silence. That kind of mystery calls for an explanation. And sometimes the explanation turns into a myth itself. Plato's most specific clue is also his most mysterious. The island was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. For us, that's the Strait of Gibraltar, the passage between Spain and Morocco, the connection between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. But for an ancient Greek, that phrase meant more than a location. It was a boundary, the edge of the known world. On one side, the orderly, familiar waters of their sea. On the other, the vast and terrifying ocean, a realm of monsters, of perpetual fog, of unimaginable depths. To say something was beyond the pillars was to place it in the space of legend. That changes the search. It might not be about a literal, sunken continent in the mid-Atlantic. It could be about understanding what that phrase collected. Any impressive society early Greek sailors encountered along the Atlantic coasts in Iberia or North Africa would, by definition, be from beyond the pillars. Their stories, their goods, their existence would be filtered through that lens of awe, through that otherness. When those societies later declined, or trade routes shifted, or a port was lost to a flood, the memory could transform. A wealthy trading partner in southern Spain becomes, over centuries, a mighty island empire in the great outer sea. Think of it like this. If you live in a small village and the only stories you hear of a distant city come from travelers who braved a treacherous mountain pass, that city starts to sound mythical. Its wealth is exaggerated, its power seems magical, and if that city ever falls, its story doesn't end with a collapse. It becomes a fable, a golden place lost because of its own pride, swallowed by the wilderness beyond the pass. The mountain pass isn't just geography, it's a narrative filter, so the Pillars of Hercules acted as that filter, a gateway to discovery, but also a barrier to clear understanding. A civilization like Tartessos was real and tangible to the traders who went there, but for the philosophers and poets back in Athens who never made the journey, Tartessos was already half a legend. Its location beyond meant its history was malleable. It could be reshaped to fit a larger lesson. This framing liberates the search from a single, impossible geological find. It asks us to look at the cultural memory of exploration. What remarkable things did those early Greek and Phoenician voyagers see on the Atlantic fringe? Grand settlements, complex societies, technological marvels unfamiliar to the Mediterranean world. The memory of those encounters, blended over time, could provide the raw material for a philosopher's grand tale. A tale of a lost, advanced civilization. The pillars were not just a marker on a map. They were the threshold where fact ended and myth began, and Atlantis, by its very definition, was born in that space. The most striking possibility might not be in the ocean. It's in Mauritania, in the Sahara, a huge bullseye in the desert, visible from space, the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara. From above, it's a perfect target, these concentric rings, and that's where a modern idea starts. Some people look at it and think of Plato's description. He described the capital of Atlantis, built on a hill near the sea, built in perfect concentric rings, 3 rings of water, 2 rings of land, a city of circles with bridges and tunnels. Satellite images of the Richat look startlingly similar. It's a natural formation, a dome worn down by erosion over millions of years. But to the eye, next to that ancient description, it's an uncanny match. The theory says this wasn't a city built as rings, but a city built inside them, that the Atlanteans used this natural formation as their foundation. The central circle becomes the citadel, the outer rings become the harbors, the districts. It fits the blueprint with an eerie precision, but the location is the obvious problem. The Richat is over 300 miles from the Atlantic coast, in one of the driest places on Earth. Plato's city was by the sea. Supporters of this idea have an answer for that. They point to a different kind of disaster, not a sinking, but a drying. Around 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. It was a savanna with rivers and lakes. Then the climate shifted, desertification began. A fertile region that supported societies slowly turned to sand. A city built near a great inland sea or a major river could have been abandoned as the water retreated. As the land died, over centuries, the memory of that lush, advanced place, lost not to waves but to dust, could have transformed. In the retelling, across time and distance, a city abandoned because its world dried up might become a city swallowed by the sea. The loss is the same, the mechanism changes in the memory. This theory is a product of our time. It comes from seeing Earth from a god's eye view. Satellite imagery gave us that perspective, letting us see patterns invisible from the ground. It's a new way of engaging with an old myth, using technology to scan the planet for clues the ancient storytellers could never see. It turns the search from diving on shipwrecks to interpreting landscapes from orbit. Yet for all its visual power, the Richat theory is still highly speculative. Intensive archaeological surveys haven't found the evidence you'd expect for a vast, advanced Bronze Age capital. No widespread ruins of grand buildings, no layers of concentrated artifacts, no signs of the massive population Plato described. What we find are scattered, much older Stone Age tools. Evidence of human presence, but not of a lost civilization. It stands as a powerful reminder of how our minds seek patterns, especially when a story is so deep in our culture. We want the map to match the territory. The Rich Hat is a breathtaking example of that desire. It shows how a myth can be so compelling that we'll find new ways and new places to try and make it real. Even if the evidence isn't there yet, the search itself tells us something about our need to solve the great mysteries of the past. Plato said this story wasn't his. He said it came from an older source passed down in his family. It started with Solon, the Athenian lawgiver. Solon went to Egypt 2 centuries before Plato. He was in the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. He spoke with the temple priests there. They were the keepers of ancient records written on papyrus on the walls of their sanctuaries. And they told Solon a story that shocked him. They said the Greeks had forgotten their own deep past, that a great civilization had existed and had been destroyed. Long before even the earliest Greek memories, Solon meant to turn that tale into an epic poem, but he never did. The notes were lost. Generations later, Plato's ancestor heard the story and passed it down. That's the chain Plato describes, and it's a crucial detail because it frames Atlantis not as a fable, but as a recovered history. A secret preserved by Egypt, the one civilization that never forgot. But how plausible is that? Could Egyptian priests really have held a memory of a catastrophe? One that happened over 1,000 years before Solon's visit. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. Their history stretched back for millennia. They documented floods, droughts, the reigns of pharaohs, but a cataclysm in a distant sea. There's no Egyptian text that says a great island in the Western Ocean sank. Yet there is a period of profound crisis in their records, one that might hold a clue. Around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean world collapsed. The Bronze Age ended in fire and chaos, and from the sea came invaders. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. The records are on the walls of Medinet Habu. They show a desperate, epic struggle. Pharaoh Ramesses III fought them in a great naval battle. He depicts them as a confederation, different groups, arriving on ships with their families, seemingly displaced, desperate for new land. They were defeated, but the world they left behind was shattered. The Hittite Empire fell, Mycenaean Greece crumbled, cities from Troy to Gaza were burned. What if the story of the Sea Peoples contains the seed? These mysterious invaders came from the sea. From islands and coasts, some scholars suggest they might have been displaced populations, sent fleeing by a chain of disasters. Could a volcanic eruption like Thera's have triggered migrations? Collapses that echoed for centuries. The Theran eruption was centuries before the Sea Peoples, but its long-term effects, the disruption of trade, the weakening of Minoan and then Mycenaean power, could have created a fragile world. A world that eventually broke apart. An Egyptian priest looking back centuries later might not remember the specific volcano, but he would remember the terrifying waves of seafarers that threatened his homeland. The story, over time, could compress. The cause and the effect could merge. The mighty island kingdom that fell and the desperate warriors who fled its collapse could become, in the telling, one and the same. A powerful empire that, upon its destruction, sent its angry survivors out to conquer. So you have two powerful memories flowing together. The Greek memory, perhaps, of the Thera cataclysm, the earth shaking, the sea rising, and the Egyptian memory of defeating the chaotic Sea Peoples. When Solon sat with those priests, he wasn't just hearing an Egyptian story. He was standing at a crossroads of cultural memory. The priest might have been telling him, in symbolic terms, the story of a great victory over chaos from the sea. Solon, an Athenian, would have heard it through his own cultural lens. He would have connected it to vague Greek legends of a lost age of heroes. In that exchange, the story transformed. It gained a location beyond the pillars in the great ocean. It gained a moral dimension, pride before a fall. It became a warning for Athens itself. This link is less about finding a specific sunken city and more about understanding how stories travel, how a historical trauma in one place becomes a legend in another. The Egyptian connection suggests that Atlantis is not a place waiting to be found on a map, but a story waiting to be understood in the long conversation between civilizations, a conversation where truth is not a fixed point, but a living thing, reshaped by every teller who seeks meaning in the ruins of the past. To see why one island could stand for all loss, you have to go back to a moment when not one world ended, but many. Around 1200 BC, the whole eastern Mediterranean system came apart. It wasn't a slow fade, it was fast, it was total. In a generation or two, the great palaces in Greece, Mycenae, Pylos, they were burned. Left empty, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, a real superpower, just stopped, gone. Ugarit, that major trading city on the Syrian coast, sent one last letter. It said, "The enemy ships are here," and then nothing. That was the late Bronze Age collapse, a catastrophe for civilization, a perfect storm where every disaster hit at once. Tree rings and sediment cores show a long, severe drought. Crops failed, year after year, famine followed, and on top of that, earthquakes, shaking cities, breaking infrastructure. The whole trade network, copper, tin, luxury goods, ideas moving between Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Greece, that network buckled, then it snapped. As resources thinned and central power weakened, people started to move. There's evidence of mass migration, groups displaced, searching. The settled kingdoms called these disruptive newcomers the Sea Peoples. They were likely both a symptom of the collapse and a cause. A human wave that made a fragile world even more unstable. The result was a deep cultural trauma. Literacy disappeared in Greece for centuries. Monumental buildings stopped. The knowledge of fine pottery, of administration, of long-distance diplomacy mostly forgotten. For the people who came later, living among the huge, broken walls of places like Mycenae, it must have seemed like giants built them. Or gods, a golden age had clearly passed, but its story was lost. The memory condensed into simpler, stronger shapes. A great war, a heroic age, a time when mighty cities fell. That's the backdrop for a myth like Atlantis. When a whole age of advanced societies can vanish so completely, leaving only ruins and silence, the idea of one perfect, lost civilization becomes a powerful container. It holds all that unexplained grandeur and all that sudden quiet in one story. The Bronze Age collapse showed that paradise wasn't just something that could be lost. It was something that had been lost many times, so the myth of Atlantis might not be the memory of one place. It could be the echo of that entire shattered world. A kind of summary, haunting, of how fragile human achievement is. No matter how magnificent it seems, the memory of lost land goes back even further. It's in the geology. So you go north to the North Sea. It's this grey, rough stretch between Britain and the Netherlands now, but 8,000 years ago that wasn't a sea. That was Doggerland, a huge plain with hills, forests, rivers, marshes, a green bridge connecting Britain to Europe, and it wasn't empty. People lived there for thousands of years. Mesolithic hunters followed reindeer and aurochs, fishermen worked the rivers, communities built homes, the land gave them everything, then the world warmed. The ice sheets melted, the oceans rose, not all at once. It was this slow, relentless advance. The sea started taking Doggerland back, a slow-motion disaster over generations. Marshes became lagoons, forests drowned, the coastline just kept moving. People would have seen their world shrink. They'd move to higher ground, tell stories about the old places now underwater. Then, around 6200 BC, something final may have happened. Evidence points to a huge underwater landslide off Norway, the Storegga Slide. That would have sent a tsunami, a wall of water across what was left of Doggerland. Any remaining islands, settlements, what was left finally went under. The map changed for good. Britain became an island. This isn't myth. It's in sediment cores, sonar maps. Archaeologists have pulled tools, bones, even soil from the seafloor. A confirmed sunken world, and it vanished long before Plato, long before the pyramids. But its legacy asks a question. Could the trauma of that loss, the slow, then sudden drowning of a whole inhabited land, last in the human story? Not as the history of Doggerland, but as a deep cultural memory, a primal story of the sea rising to claim the land. Folklore from coastal cultures everywhere talks of sunken cities. Bells heard under the waves, lands lost to the water. These stories feel archetypal. They speak to a basic human experience, watching the shore change, knowing the sea holds places that were once home. The Atlantis myth, with its image of a prosperous land swallowed by the ocean, might tap right into that ancient shared fear. It gives a name, a time, a moral to a loss that's almost too old to remember. Plato's details the rings, the war, the advanced society. Those are just ornaments, hung on a much older tree. The tree is the memory, passed down through generations in oral tradition. A memory of a time when the world was different, when the sea wasn't so wide, and when the water took what was ours. Doggerland shows that some myths aren't about a place we lost. They're about the process of loss itself, so the story of Atlantis becomes more than a puzzle. It becomes an echo of the first time we stood on a shore, watched the rising tide, and told a story about what lies beneath. Maybe the deepest answer isn't on a map at all, it's in the story. After all the searching across oceans and deserts, we might have been looking the wrong way. What if Atlantis was never supposed to be found in the ground, but understood in the mind? Plato was a moral philosopher first. He watched Athens suffer defeat, political chaos, what he saw as a loss of civic virtue. His whole life's work was trying to answer one question: how do you build a just society, and then how does that society fall? So in that light, Atlantis isn't a history lesson. It's a thought experiment, an allegory, a brilliant one and terrifying. The details are so vivid not because they're real, but because they need to feel real for the lesson to stick. Think about the society he describes. It starts in a golden age, founded by Poseidon, orderly, virtuous, in harmony with the divine. The people live under just laws. They're modest, wise, spiritually pure. That's Plato's ideal state, his republic placed in a mythical past. But then, generation by generation, the divine part in them fades. He writes that human nature gained the upper hand. And what does that look like? Greed, ambition, a thirst for power and luxury. They stop valuing wisdom and start valuing conquest. Their incredible technology, their military might once used for stability, they turn outward, they become arrogant, they try to enslave the whole Mediterranean. That's the core of it. A perfect society rots from within, long before it's crushed from without. The earthquakes, the flood, those aren't the cause of the downfall. They're the consequence, the cosmic reset button pressed on a civilization that lost its way. For Plato's audience, the warning was direct, contemporary. Athens had just been through the Peloponnesian War, a conflict many saw as the result of imperial overreach, moral decay. The story of Atlantis was asking them a question: are we next? Could our own prosperity and power be leading us toward the same kind of collapse? That changes the search completely. The inspiration for Atlantis shifts from a geological event to a social observation. Plato was probably inspired by the cyclical nature of history he saw everywhere: the rise and fall of empires, the patterns of hubris and nemesis. He didn't need a single sunken city. He needed a symbol, a powerful one, that could hold all of humanity's fragile triumphs and its self-inflicted collapses. Later philosophers have seen it this way for a long time. It's a myth in the deepest sense, a story that uses the language of fantasy to tell a fundamental truth about the human condition. The truth that no advancement, no wall, no fleet can protect a society that abandons its own soul. So the enduring power of Atlantis might have very little to do with tsunamis or volcanic ash. Its real spark comes from a philosopher looking at his own world, seeing the cracks in its foundation, and crafting a story so compelling we'd still be debating it 2,000 years later. He gave us a mirror, not a map, and in that mirror we don't see a lost continent, we see ourselves. But the Atlantic, that's the strongest call. If you take Plato literally, then it has to be the Atlantic. That huge ocean, and right in the middle of it there's this feature, the Azores Plateau. It's a massive underwater rise centered on those volcanic islands. From the seafloor it comes up like a drowned mountain range, the highest points breaking the surface as the Azores, but its slopes stretch far out underwater, under hundreds of meters of water. The idea is simple. In the last ice age, sea levels were much lower. A lot of water was locked in ice. The ocean surface was over 100 meters lower than today. Back then, the Azores Plateau wouldn't have been just a few islands. It would have been a much bigger archipelago, maybe even one solid landmass, a true mid-Atlantic island, right where Plato said. For some, that's not just speculation, it's geological fact. A land bridge that vanished as the ice melted and the seas rose. It gives Atlantis a plausible home. Not a continent that sank in a day from earthquakes, but one slowly reclaimed by the rising ocean over centuries. It turns the cataclysm from a sudden punishment into a gradual, natural process. Something our ancestors might have witnessed and told stories about for generations. But for all that geographical fit, the Azores idea has one huge, quiet problem. No proof. If a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization lived on that exposed plateau, it would have left traces, foundations, pottery, tools, the debris of settlement. Intensive archaeology on the existing Azores Islands has found nothing like that. The earliest confirmed human presence is medieval with the Portuguese. Sonar mapping of the submerged plateau shows fascinating geology, seamounts, ridges, ancient riverbeds from when it was above water, but no sunken cityscapes. No straight lines of harbors or temples. The ocean floor there tells a story of volcanoes and erosion, not human achievement. That silence is profound. It suggests if people ever lived on those larger Ice Age shores, they were probably small, transient groups, hunter-gatherers, not the marble-clad masters of a global empire. Their passing left no monuments to find. So why does this idea last? Why is the Azores Plateau still a candidate? Because it's the purest form of the search. It's the literal interpretation of the myth, played out on the very stage Plato named. This hypothesis is driven less by hard evidence and more by a powerful, romantic desire. The desire for the story to be true in the most direct physical sense. A continent lost under the Atlantic waves, that's a poetic, haunting image. It speaks to our fascination with the unknown depths. With the idea that history's greatest secrets are still hidden, just out of reach under miles of dark water. It's where oceanography meets legend. Every new sonar scan, every deep sea dive in the Atlantic is, in a way, part of this ancient search. We're using 21st century tools to test a story from the 4th century BCE. The Azores theory, in the end, is less about finding Atlantis and more about the enduring human need to look. To point to a blank space on the map or a blue space on the globe and say, what if it was here? That question keeps the myth alive. It turns every unexplained underwater formation into a potential clue. And it ensures the Atlantic Ocean will never quite seem empty. The loss wasn't just a Mediterranean story. There was another civilization far to the east along the Indus River. It vanished too, the Indus Valley culture, the Harappans. Their cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, they were laid out on grids. They had covered sewers, drainage. Homes made from uniform baked bricks. They used the same weights and measures across a huge area. It suggests an organized society, maybe without a single king. Their trade went from Mesopotamia to the Indian coast. Then, around 1900 BCE, it started to come apart. The cities weren't destroyed in a war. They were abandoned slowly. People left, the urban centers went quiet. Their script, those symbols on seals and pottery, it's never been read. That voice was lost. The reason seems to be climate. The rivers that gave them life, the Indus, the Gaga Hakra, they might have shifted course, tectonic movement or drought. The monsoons may have failed. The land couldn't support the cities anymore. It was a slow dissolution, not a bang, a long, quiet sigh. This story, though it's thousands of miles from the Atlantic, it touches the Atlantis myth. Here was a sophisticated, seemingly peaceful society, a master of its environment that just disappeared, its knowledge the urban planning, the water management forgotten. To people later on in India, these ruins would have been mysterious, the work of a lost race or gods. The parallel is strong. It means the human experience of finding ruins and wondering what happened, that's universal. So Atlantis might not be a memory of one specific catastrophe. It could be a composite, a story woven from many different threads, the violent end of a Minoan outpost. The slow drought that emptied the Indus cities, the rising seas that swallowed Doggerland, the whole Bronze Age collapse. In the mixing of ancient trade and stories, these fragments blended. The result was a single, perfect archetype, a glorious civilization, advanced and proud, that met a mysterious end. Looking east to the Indus shows the myth's power doesn't come from geographical accuracy. It comes from an emotional truth. It speaks to a deep, shared anxiety that no matter how high we build or how well we plan or how far our trade reaches, our foundations are fragile. The climate can shift, the rivers can run dry, the sea can rise, and all that's left are stories. That transformation is the real magic. It's the alchemy of collective memory. A story doesn't travel through time unchanged. It's carried and reshaped and polished by every person who tells it. Take a traumatic event, a devastating flood that wipes out a village. The survivors don't just record the facts. They tell the story of the rising water, the frantic escape, the loss of their home. That story becomes part of their identity. A warning for their children, and when those children tell it, the details might sharpen. The flood becomes higher, the village more prosperous before the disaster. A generation later, it's not just a flood, it's a punishment from the gods for some forgotten wrong. The story grows in scale, it gains moral weight. Now apply this to something like the collapse of a major trading partner. For centuries, Greek sailors might have heard tales from their grandparents. Tales about the wealthy kingdom of Tartessos far to the west. As contact faded, the tales would fill the void. How rich were they? Their king lived for 120 years. Their rivers flowed with silver, and then they were gone. Why? Perhaps a great flood or an earthquake. The story explains the unexplainable. Over 500 years of this oral transmission, a real but distant civilization can be transformed into something mythical. Its wealth becomes limitless, its power becomes godlike, its end becomes a cosmic event. This is how history becomes legend. It's not a lie. It's an interpretation, repeated and amplified across generations. We see this pattern everywhere, most clearly in flood myths. Cultures from Mesopotamia to China to the Americas have stories of a great deluge. For a long time, scholars wondered if this pointed to one global catastrophe. But the simpler explanation is that floods are a universal human experience. Every river valley, every coastline has flooded at some point. A particularly bad one becomes the flood. The story gets attached to cultural heroes like Noah or Utnapishtim. It becomes a foundational myth about cleansing and rebirth. The real event was likely a local disaster. The myth is its legacy. It carries a deeper truth about human vulnerability and resilience. So when we ask what inspired Atlantis, we might be asking the wrong question. We're looking for one sunken city, one volcanic eruption, but the answer is likely a chorus of whispers, the whisper of a Minoan trader's descendant talking about the island that blew apart. The whisper of an Egyptian priest recounting the victory over the chaotic sea peoples, the whisper of a Celtic storyteller remembering a fertile plain now under the North Sea. All these whispers traveled the ancient trade routes. They mingled in ports and marketplaces. By the time they reached Plateau, they had merged into a single, powerful narrative. A narrative about a perfect society that fell. This doesn't make Atlantis less real. It makes it more profound. It becomes a monument not built from stone, but from memory. A story that endures because it speaks to something true about our world, that civilizations rise and they fall, and we are left to make meaning from the ruins. The search for its inspiration, then, isn't an archaeological dig. It's a study of the human heart. How do we remember, and why do we need to tell stories about what was lost? The most compelling evidence can be the smallest. There's a city off the southern coast of the Peloponnese in Vatica Bay. The water is clear and shallow. And the city is truly sunk. Its name is Pavlopetri. A geologist found it in 1967, but its real age, its significance, that only came clear decades later. With modern underwater archaeology, this isn't a myth, it's a grid of streets, foundations of homes, courtyards, tombs, all preserved beneath the sea. It dates back over 5,000 years, the oldest known submerged city in the world. To walk its lanes now you need scuba gear, not imagination. You see the layout of a complete Bronze Age settlement. Frozen, the cause of the sinking was almost certainly seismic. An earthquake, the land subsided, and the Mediterranean waters claimed it slowly, maybe over generations. This wasn't a violent, single-day event. It was a gradual surrender, and that's what makes it instructive. Pavlopetri is modest, a thriving port but not a vast capital. Its existence proves a point to archaeologists, to anyone listening to these old stories. The concept of a sunken city in the Greek world wasn't a fantasy. It was a reality. Communities along these fault lines knew the sea as a neighbor that could take back the land and sometimes did. A settlement could be engulfed. Its memory would linger in local folklore. Fishermen might point to calm waters, tell their children a city sleeps down there. Over centuries, a local tragedy like that could be a seed. For something grander, imagine a much larger port, a Minoan or Mycenaean trade hub, suffering a similar fate. The story of its loss would be more dramatic. The scale more impressive, the echo longer. Pavlopetri provides the concrete model. It shows the mechanism, the archaeological blueprint for how a place becomes a ghost beneath the waves. So when we hear Plato's description, rings and harbors lost to the sea, we don't have to look only to massive volcanoes or continental shifts. We can look to the quiet bay near Elaphanisos and see a truth just as powerful. Real cities did sink here. Their stories didn't die. They drifted like silt into the deep channels of legend waiting to be found. Pavlopetri shows the sea can take a city, but the scale of the terror, that's what matters. A single violent event, it etches itself into memory differently. The eruption at Thera, it wasn't just an explosion, it was a world-ending spectacle. The sky would have darkened for days, for weeks, ash raining down like gray snow. And then the tsunamis, walls of water moving faster than a horse can run. For anyone seeing that or surviving it, the experience was beyond comprehension. It was apocalyptic. Geologists can look at the ash layers, reconstruct the mechanics, but they also point to the psychological impact. A society with no concept of plate tectonics, no idea of magma chambers. They'd have only one framework for an event like that: the gods, the earth shaking, the sea rising, the sun blotted out. Those are the classic signatures in mythologies worldwide of divine anger. The memory isn't stored like a weather report. It's stored as a story of punishment, a story about why the gods were angry. That's the raw material of legend. Trauma crystallized into narrative. Now contrast that with the loss of Doggerland. That was a slow creep, a gradual drowning over generations. You might not even notice the change in your own lifetime. Your grandfather's fishing grounds become a shallow bay. The old stories talk of forests where there's now open water. That kind of loss creates a different myth. Not one of sudden divine wrath. It becomes a story of a forgotten time, a lost golden age when the land was whole, a melancholy folktale, not a cataclysmic warning. Both processes create legends, but the fast, violent events, those are the ones that birth gods and monsters. They demand an explanation as dramatic as the event itself. Historians note this. Pre-scientific societies were brilliant interpreters of patterns. They saw agency in nature. A devastating flood wasn't a random hydrological event. It was a message. The community would ask itself, what did we do wrong? Did we offend Poseidon? Neglect a sacrifice? Become too proud? That interpretive leap from natural disaster to moral failing, it's central to almost every ancient catastrophe myth. The story provides a cause for the uncaused. It returns a sense of order, of meaning, to a chaotic and terrifying universe. If the gods destroyed us because we were arrogant, then the world still operates on rules. Terrible rules, but rules we can understand. Rules we could, theoretically, avoid. This is the precise engine of Plato's Atlantis tale. The island isn't destroyed by a random tectonic shift. It's obliterated because its people grew greedy, corrupt, militaristic. Their technology and power could not save them from the judgment of the gods. Plato took a template that would have been deeply familiar to any Greek, the story of a city struck down by divine will for its hubris, like Helike, and he enlarged it. To a continental scale, he used the most powerful myth-making mechanism his culture knew, the moralizing natural disaster. By framing it this way, his philosophical lesson about the decay of the ideal state, it wasn't just a lecture. It was a seismic event in story form. The audience would have felt the truth of it in their bones because their entire cultural memory was built on such truths. The ground could literally open up and swallow you for your sins. Atlantis was that lesson, written not on a scroll but across the ocean floor. Plato had this blueprint for Atlantis. And it's a blueprint that feels familiar. He describes a capital city on a hill near the sea, designed in perfect concentric rings, 3 rings of water, 2 rings of land. All connected with bridges and tunnels. It sounds like fantasy, but this idea of a circular, fortified city that wasn't something Plato invented. You see echoes of it. The Nurag in Sardinia, those massive stone towers, often with circular bastions and walls around them, or early Mesopotamian cities with their rings of fortification. Ordering a city in rings from a sacred center out to defensive walls, that was a known architectural principle. Plato didn't conjure it from nothing. He took a known concept and amplified it to a divine scale, making it the ultimate expression of order and power. Then there's the metal orichalcum. Plato says it covered the walls of the central temple, gleaming with a fiery red light. For centuries that was thought to be mythical, but the word itself offers a clue. It likely means mountain copper. Historians and metallurgists think it was probably a high-grade bronze or brass, an alloy that could have a reddish, gold-like sheen. In the Bronze Age Mediterranean, the ability to work with metals to create alloys, that was the pinnacle of technology. The Minoans were master metalworkers. Their bronze was traded everywhere. By describing a metal that shone like fire, Plato was giving Atlantis a marker of supreme technological advancement. Something his audience would recognize as the hallmark of a great civilization. He was essentially saying they had the best bronze in the world. This maritime power he describes is another direct parallel. Atlantis is a thalassocracy, a sea empire. Its power comes from its harbors, its massive fleet, its control of trade routes. That's a mirror image of known historical powers. The Minoans, with their palace at Knossos, commanded the seas without massive fortifications. Their influence flowed from their ships. The Phoenicians, legendary sailors and traders, networks across the Mediterranean. Plato's Atlanteans are the ultimate expression of this model, a naval superpower that uses its mastery of the sea to project influence and eventually to attempt conquest. He took a real-world source of political power and imagined it perfected. Perhaps the most telling cultural clue is the bull. In Plato's story, the kings of Atlantis would gather in the temple of Poseidon to ritualistically hunt a bull without weapons, using only staves and nooses. That's a vivid, specific image, and it resonates with what we know of Minoan Crete. Bulls were central to Minoan art and likely to their ceremonial life. The famous fresco of bull leaping from Knossos shows acrobats vaulting over a bull's back. While not a direct match for the Atlantean ritual, it points to a culture where the bull held profound symbolic, possibly religious significance, associated with power, the earth, and the sea god Poseidon. Plato or his sources seem to have borrowed this potent symbol, woven it into the fabric of Atlantis, giving the lost civilization a recognizable cultural fingerprint. So when you piece these parallels together, what are you looking at? You're not looking at a carbon copy of one society. You're looking at a brilliant act of synthesis. A philosopher or storyteller, drawing from the world around him, takes the circular fortifications from one tradition, the metalworking prowess from another, the naval dominance from a third, and the sacred bull from a fourth. He combines them, amplifies them, places them on a mythical island in the Atlantic. The result feels believable because its parts are real. They're fragments of the Mediterranean's cultural memory, assembled into a new and compelling whole. That's how a legend is built, not from pure invention, but from the rearrangement of reality. The genius of Atlantis lies not in its originality, but in its familiarity. It feels like a civilization we have almost known, because in many ways we have. Atland, that's the name, up in the north in the Old Norse records. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, it's not a fable, it's a genealogy. It lists families and it says they descended from kings, kings of a land that sank. A land that was rich, fertile, advanced people, and then the ocean took it. The parallels are clear. A prosperous place, capable people, gone under the water. But here, it's not about punishment, not about morals. It's just loss, a fact, etched into family lines. Scholars, they look at this, they see a memory. A real memory of coastal flooding, land sinking. After the last ice age, the North Sea, the Baltic coastlines, they changed. Settlements were consumed. Whole settlements may be culturally distinct, may be sophisticated in their own way, gone, witnessed over generations. That became the law. This Nordic version, it tells us something. The sunken, advanced land, that idea, it's not a Greek invention. It's not just the Mediterranean. It's a human thing, an archetype, a story that comes up wherever people live by a shore. A shoreline that can retreat or surge and take everything. So Atlantis isn't an outlier. It's just one expression, a particularly eloquent one, but part of a global phenomenon. From the Greek Atlantic to the Nordic Atland, from the drowned forests of Doggerland to the submerged ports in Greece, humanity has always lived with this knowledge. The sea gives and the sea takes away. Our stories, they're the monuments we build for what was lost. They're maps, not of geography, but of memory. And in that shared cartography of loss, we find a common heritage, that legend of a perfect place swallowed by the waves. It might be one of the oldest stories we all tell. The need to find Atlantis, that human need, it hasn't gone away. It's just changed. The tools are different now. We went from old texts to sonar, from debates to satellite photos. And that passion, it sent people out there, real expeditions, scientific ones, and sensational ones too. Some are out there with submersibles, with sediment cores. looking for that one piece of pottery, that one thing that changes everything. And then there are the other methods, the unconventional ones, psychic readings, channeling Atlantean priests. Theories that put the lost continent in Antarctica or off the coast of Cuba. And this is where the search for a legend, it meets the modern world, pseudoarchaeology. That space where open-minded inquiry and wishful thinking, that line gets blurred. Pseudoarchaeology doesn't begin with evidence. It doesn't follow the evidence to a conclusion. It starts with the conclusion that Atlantis was real and it was right here, and then it gathers evidence to support that. It interprets things to fit. And it dismisses whatever contradicts the story. It ignores Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the right one. Take the Bimini Road. Off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, there's this formation, rectangular limestone blocks sitting in shallow water. To some, it looks unmistakable. A paved road, a harbor wall, built by human hands, a piece of Atlantis. The excitement when it was found was real, but geologists have studied it extensively. They explain it as beach rock, a natural cementation of sand and shell. It fractures into block-like shapes along natural joints. The whole formation fits natural processes. No tool marks, no mortar, no cultural artifacts nearby, no pottery, no tools, nothing to signal human construction. But for the people committed to the idea, that geological explanation, it's a cover-up. A dismissal, mainstream science unwilling to accept a truth that changes everything. A similar story with the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. Massive, terraced sandstone formations underwater, sharp angles, flat surfaces. They look like stepped pyramids, like platforms. It's breathtaking. You can see why someone would call it a sunken city. Maybe a Pacific Atlantis, but marine geologists point to the location. It's in an active seismic zone. Sandstone in that region fractures, horizontal and vertical planes from tectonic stress. Then ocean currents erode the softer material. They sculpt it. What's left are these geometric shapes. A few features are intriguing. The debate continues, but the consensus is clear. Yonaguni is a natural formation, a testament to what geology can create, something that looks, to our pattern-seeking minds, like architecture. This isn't to say all unconventional searches are without merit. Sometimes they push mainstream science. They point to places that might have been overlooked. The passion itself is an engine, a powerful engine for curiosity. The problem is when that passion rejects evidence, when it chooses a compelling story over a complicated truth, a less glamorous truth. It often targets real mysteries. The precise purpose of Stonehenge, the construction of the pyramids, and it offers simple answers, sensational answers, answers that bypass the hard work. The careful digging, the carbon dating, the peer-reviewed analysis. So the modern hunt for Atlantis, it becomes a checkpoint for critical thinking. How do you evaluate an extraordinary claim? You look for extraordinary evidence. You ask if the theory accounts for all the data, or just the pieces that fit. You see if it's proposed by people with real expertise. If it's published where other experts can scrutinize it. This skeptical eye, it's not about crushing wonder. It's about honoring the real past by seeking the real truth. However ordinary it seems, the enduring power of the Atlantis myth, it doesn't require a literal truth on the ocean floor. Its truth is in what it reveals about us. Our fear of collapse, our longing for a golden age, that insatiable drive to solve the great puzzles, the ones left by time, that human passion, that's the real artifact. Unearthed again, every time a new generation looks at the sea and wonders, what if this idea of a sunken world didn't just stay in old books, it came back strong in the modern age. It found a new home in the things that shape our imagination. The Atlantis legend, built from those pieces of memory, became a fixture in popular culture. It was the perfect setting for stories of wonder, for stories of warning. Jules Verne saw that in his 1870 novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Captain Nemo takes the Nautilus past the ruins of the lost continent. Verne writes about broken columns, statues covered in growth sitting on the ocean floor, a quiet, haunting museum of a people that fell. This wasn't just a fantasy backdrop. It was a statement. Here you had humanity's most advanced technology, the Nautilus, moving past the wreckage of an earlier peak. The scene combined the thrill of discovery with a deep sadness. A theme that would stick to Atlantis from then on. The 20th century made it louder. As movies grew, so did the visual spectacle of the lost city. The 1961 film Atlantis, The Lost Continent, showed it as a place of advanced science that turned bad. Classical looks mixed with ray guns that reflected a new worry, the fear of technology in the wrong hands. But maybe the most lasting pop culture version came with Disney's animated film in 2001. There, Atlantis was reimagined, a thriving, glowing empire powered by a mystical energy source. Its people preserved under the sea in a bubble. The film leaned into the core appeal, the discovery of a beautiful, forgotten world, a place that holds the key to ancient wisdom. It framed Atlantis not as a warning about pride, but as a place to save, a heritage to reclaim. That shift means something. It shows how the myth can be shaped to fit what we want now. Whether it's adventure or a link to a purer past or an environmental story, beyond big movies, the idea is everywhere. It names space shuttles. It titles progressive rock albums. It's the plot for endless video games where you explore underwater ruins for treasure and secrets. This lasting echo points to something more than a good setting. The Atlantis story meets a basic narrative need. It's a blank slate for our hopes and fears about civilization itself. In times of fast technological change, it becomes a story about the danger of going too far. In times of environmental worry, it's a parable about fragility. When we feel cut off from history, it offers a romantic vision of a sophisticated ancestor. A golden age we can dream of finding again. The myth's journey from a possible memory of real disasters to a global cultural symbol is its own kind of wonder. It proves that a story, once let loose, lives its own life. It adapts, it changes. Each retelling in a novel or a film or a comic adds another layer, blurring the line further between what was imagined and what might have been. We're not just looking for Atlantis in the ocean mud. We're always rebuilding it in our art, projecting our own world's wonders and worries onto those sunken towers. The legend lasts not because we've found it, but because we still need it. A shimmering, half-remembered dream of what we once were, and a quiet warning of what we might become. The timeline for Atlantis can extend beyond human history entirely. There's a theory that goes back millions of years before humans existed. It centers on a geological event of almost unimaginable scale, the Zanclean Flood. About 5.3 million years ago, the Mediterranean Sea was cut off from the Atlantic. It had mostly evaporated. What was left was a huge, deep basin of salt and desert with hypersaline lakes sitting far below the level of the world's oceans. Then the natural dam at the Strait of Gibraltar broke. The Atlantic poured in, not a trickle, a cataclysmic, unstoppable torrent. The waterfall over that new breach would have been over a kilometer high. A roar heard for thousands of miles. It filled the entire Mediterranean basin in what was geologically an instant. Maybe just a few years, the sea level in the basin rose by meters per day. Coastlines that had been dry for millennia were violently and permanently drowned. This isn't speculation. It's written in the geology, in the sediment layers on the seafloor, in the ancient river channels now underwater that once cut across the dry basin. The Zanclean Flood was one of the most dramatic resculptings of the planet's surface in recent geological history. So the connection to Atlantis, a story told by humans who appeared only a few 100,000 years ago, isn't literal. No one thinks Plato was describing a 5 million-year-old event. But this theory shows the extreme flexibility of the Atlantis myth, its gravitational pull. When you have a story about a lost land swallowed by the sea, and then science reveals a real event where a vast, dry region was catastrophically flooded, the mind looks for a link. Some suggest such a profound geological trauma might have left a faint, almost genetic imprint, a primal memory of drowning lands passed down in flood myths. Or more practically, that early humans migrating into the Mediterranean would have encountered the evidence. They would have seen fossil shells high in cliffs, far from any shore. They would have heard local legends, maybe born from observing those very features, about a time when the sea wasn't here, and then it was. Those stories they propose could have been the oldest seeds. The original cataclysm that later got attached to a more recent human story of a fallen civilization. This idea pushes the search to its outermost limit. It says the inspiration for Atlantis might not be a historical society falling, but the land itself being born or reborn in violence. The myth becomes a vessel not just for human anxiety about collapse, but for the planet's own turbulent, indifferent history. It shows the power of the Atlantis story is so great it can absorb even the deep time narratives of geology. We look at the calm blue of the Mediterranean today and have a hard time picturing it as a desert or witnessing its violent filling. But science says it happened, and once you know that, the old story feels different. It gains a deeper resonance. The sea wasn't just taking something away. It was reclaiming its own. This theory, while a fringe idea in Atlantean research, serves a profound purpose. It reminds us that our planet's memory is written in stone and water on a timescale that dwarfs our own. And our oldest stories, in their search for meaning, sometimes reach back and touch that immense, silent history. They try to give a human face to events that had no witnesses. Except perhaps the land itself. Long before Plato, the Greek imagination already had sunken lands, drowned giants, the war between the Olympians and the Titans. That was a cosmic restructuring. Landscapes were born from chaos and then submerged in defeat. The Titans were imprisoned beneath the earth, beneath the sea. Their realm was a lost world, a primordial power buried under what we know now. Even Orion, the hunter, in some versions he wasn't just placed in the stars. He walked across the seafloor, his head above the waves, like he was traversing the ruins of a drowned kingdom. These stories weren't about historical civilizations, but they established a vocabulary, the sea as a place of loss, of hidden realms, of giants and gods from a time before time. Plato was a philosopher, but he was also a storyteller working inside that tradition. He didn't create from a void. He likely took those motifs, the cataclysmic war, the figure walking through the sea, the sunken divine age, and he refined them. He stripped away the purely supernatural, replaced it with a human society. The Titans became the Atlanteans, a powerful, arrogant race from a bygone era. They challenged the divine order and were punished, cast down into the depths. That image of Orion striding through the ocean, that could have provided a kernel. A poetic idea of vast, submerged architecture, waiting to be traversed. Plato was synthesizing. He gathered the mythological echoes, land sinking, gods battling. He fused them with more recent memories, real events like Helike's fate, tales of Minoan Crete, and he combined that with his philosophical concepts. Justice, societal decay, divine retribution, the result was something new. Atlantis wasn't just another myth about gods, it was a myth about us. It used the familiar language sunken realms, lost ages, to ask a modern question. What if our own civilization, with all its technology and pride, is just as fragile as those of legend? By weaving these older threads into a pseudo-historical narrative, Plato gave his lesson an authority. It felt discovered, not invented, so Atlantis isn't an anomaly, it's a hybrid, a philosophical argument wearing the clothes of a very old, very powerful story. It succeeded because it felt true on multiple levels. It resonated with a deep cultural memory of cataclysm. It echoed recent historical traumas. It spoke to the political anxieties of his day. The genius wasn't in finding a new story. It was in remixing the oldest ones into a warning for the future. The pull of Atlantis isn't really about geography. It's emotional, it speaks to something in us. We tell stories, and one of our oldest stories is about decline, a golden age, a time of greater wisdom, purity, harmony. And then it's lost, that nostalgia for a better past, it's everywhere. The Greeks had their age of heroes, the Garden of Eden in Abrahamic traditions. Cultures everywhere talk about a time when people lived closer to the gods, understood nature's secrets, knew a peace we can't really imagine now. Atlantis fits right into that. It gives that vague sense of loss a specific place, a map, a technology, a history. We're not just mourning some vague better time, we're mourning a concrete civilization. Advanced engineering, spiritual unity, that specificity makes the longing feel more real, more poignant, and it connects to another desire, the desire for origins. We want to know where we came from, not just biologically, culturally, spiritually. The official historical record can feel fragmented, incremental, mundane. The idea that our true origins lie in a spectacular, advanced society, one that ended dramatically, that's a more satisfying narrative. It suggests our current state isn't our peak. It's a fragmented echo of something greater, that our potential isn't something we're building toward. It's something we're trying to rediscover. That belief can be a comfort. It means the answers to our biggest questions about technology, consciousness, balance, they aren't lost forever. They're just waiting, buried under sand or sea. For us to find them again, it turns the human journey from a slow climb out of ignorance into a quest, a heroic quest to reclaim a stolen inheritance. There's also a strange comfort in the fall itself. If a perfect society with all its knowledge and power could still collapse, then our own modern anxieties are validated. Our fears about environmental disaster, technological overreach, moral decay, they're not new, they're ancient, they're part of a cycle. The Atlantis myth tells us even the greatest can fail. And that makes our own struggles feel less like unique failures, more like part of a grand, tragic pattern. It's a cautionary tale that feels preordained. Which is paradoxically reassuring. It gives collapse a framework, a clear moral cause, hubris, greed, a turn away from the divine. In a chaotic world, a story where disaster has a clear logic can feel more manageable than one where catastrophe is random. Meaningless, this psychological allure is why the search is so persistent, so passionate. We're not just looking for pottery shards on the ocean floor. We're looking for validation, validation of our hope that we were once more than we are, and validation of our fear that we're on a path to the same watery silence. The myth endures because it holds both these emotions in balance. It lets us dream of rediscovering lost glory while warning us about the price of pride. That duality makes it endlessly adaptable. Whether we're in an era of optimistic exploration or existential dread, the story can be molded to fit. It becomes a mirror, reflecting our deepest aspirations and our most profound anxieties. So the search continues, not because the evidence demands it, but because our hearts do. We keep diving, scanning, debating, because finding a real Atlantis would mean finding a part of ourselves we desperately wish was real. A wiser, more connected, more complete version of humanity. Waiting just beneath the surface of history and just beneath the waves, archaeology has a quieter voice in this. It works with earth and sea, not stories. And what it finds is solid. It grounds things. Take the candidates. The eruption of Thera is a fact. the ash layers are there. Akrotiri is a town buried, a society stopped in place. Then the Minoan decline, the palaces damaged, sites abandoned. That's in the record. These are truths. The tsunami at Helike is documented. The city's remains are likely underwater. These events happened. They were disasters for the people there. But when you look for proof of Plato's Atlantis as a real place, the ground goes quiet. No tablet at Thera says this is Atlantis. No harbor in the Atlantic matches the description. No destruction layer dates to 9,000 years before Plato. There's no labeled box for a lost continent. Instead, the record shows something more like a tapestry, woven from threads of real loss, the thread of the Minoans, their influence fading. The thread of Helike, gone in a night, the thread of Tartessos, a kingdom lost to marshes, the thread of Doggerland, a landscape taken by the sea. These weren't myths. They were real. Communities that flourished faced catastrophe or faded away. They left pottery, stones, questions. That's the synthesis. The Atlantis legend didn't come from nothing. It came from the memory of these disappearances. A Greek trader hears an Egyptian priest talk of the sea peoples. A storyteller combines that with sailor tales of a wealthy land that's gone. A philosopher hears of Helike's fate and sees a mechanism for divine punishment. Over time, these threads: a volcano here, a sunken city there, a lost kingdom, they braid together in the oral tradition. They become one story, a story powerful enough for Plato to use to carry his lesson about society. This view doesn't shrink the myth, it deepens it. You see the historical kernels inside the grand narrative without the speculation. You can respect the story's power, its warning about hubris, its sadness for what's lost, and also respect the discipline of archaeology, which uncovers the smaller, real human tragedies, the ones that feed our oldest tales. The truth might not be a sunken continent. It might be a chorus of echoes from a fragile past. And in that chorus, you hear the real inspiration for the legend. The most compelling answer isn't about picking one candidate. It's the pattern they make together. Atlantis is probably a synthesis, a philosophical allegory built from real memories. Plato, or the tradition he was working from, was a master storyteller. He started with the template of the Thera eruption, an island civilization destroyed by earth and sea. Then he added the recent shock of Helike, a city sacred to Poseidon that vanished overnight. And then the mystery of Tartessos, that wealthy kingdom beyond the pillars of Hercules that just faded away. These specific events were set against the wider backdrop of the late Bronze Age collapse, when entire sophisticated worlds fell into silence. And under all of that was the universal archetype, from Doggerland to Pavlopetri, the sunken city, the land taken back by the water. What Plato did was stitch these pieces into one tapestry. He took the emotional truth of these losses, the awe, the terror, and gave them a name, a location, and a moral cause. The synthesis served his purpose. By grounding the fable in fragments of real history, the story gained weight. It felt true because its parts were true. An audience in Athens would have recognized the echoes. The suddenness of Helike, the vague tales of Minoan grandeur, the traders' stories of Western riches lost. So when Plato spoke of a proud island nation swallowed by the sea as punishment, it resonated on multiple levels. It wasn't a wild invention, it was a reorganization of cultural memory. This composite explanation works because it honors both the myth and the evidence. We don't have to dismiss Plato as a fabulist, and we don't have to ignore archaeology. Instead, it shows how legends are born. Real events, traumatic and unexplained, generate stories. Those stories travel and mix and get polished by retelling. Eventually, a philosophical mind of great skill collects them. He sees their common theme, the fragility of human achievement, and refines them into a warning. So Atlantis is more than the sum of its parts. It's the ghost in the machine of history, a whisper made of many whispers, a story that endures because by weaving together so many real threads of loss, it speaks to a deep truth that civilizations rise and fall and leave behind stories to mark where they were. We started with a philosopher's courtyard, then a volcano, a continent slowly drowning, a city gone silent. What we have isn't one sunken island, it's a mosaic. Each tile is a real piece of history, the ash from Thera, the flooded streets of Helike, the lost wealth of Tartessos, the green plains of Doggerland, now seabed. These aren't fantasies, they're the raw materials of a legend. Plato, or the tradition he inherited, took these fragments of loss and wove them into one narrative. A story about the fragility of human achievement. Atlantis endures not as a historical report, but as a synthesis. It gives shape to our anxieties about prosperity and pride, about nature's power and the impermanence of everything we build. We may never dive on its marble columns, we may never hold a coin from its kings, but in searching, we've uncovered something more meaningful. We've seen how our ancestors grappled with the unexplainable. A cataclysm too vast becomes a story of divine judgment. A vanished civilization becomes a cautionary tale. Trauma and mystery get processed through narrative, transformed into myth so they can be understood. Remembered, learned from, the real Atlantis isn't a location, it's a process. It's the human instinct to take the shards of a broken world and assemble them into a story that makes sense of the breaking. This legend is a testament to the power of memory, a memory that stretches back through tsunamis and eruptions, through the collapse of ages and the slow creep of the sea. It reminds us our history isn't just written in stone and ink, but in the stories we tell about what was lost. In the end, the most compelling discovery isn't at the bottom of the ocean. It's in the enduring need to look at the waves, to ponder the ruins, and to ask what happened here and what it means for us.